Hey guys, this is Ms.A, and in this lesson, we're going to do a quick review of foreshadowing and the different types or the different ways that an author can include foreshadowing. So obviously, if we're going to start to talk about foreshadowing, we should start to just kind of talk about, well, what does it mean when an author uses foreshadowing? So foreshadowing is a technique that an author can choose to include in their writing. It works best when there is some kind of mystery or some kind of reveal that's going to happen at the end of a story. But really, it doesn't have to be a mystery story. It can be used, in any story, because every story follows a sequence of events. It has a plot, and an author is always building up event after event after event until you get to the ending. And the key to foreshadowing is that it is the author's way of dropping little hints or clues that can help us, the reader, predict what's going to happen later on in the story. Now, those predictions could be for the final event of the story, could be all building up towards the ending, but it could also just be for little events that happen along the way. Anything that is in the story that, in other words, starts to make you suspicious, starts to make your brain go, wait a minute, I think I know what's going to happen next. That would be considered foreshadowing. And so because foreshadowing is just a hint, is just a clue, is just, even it's built into the word, it's just a shadow, right? Shadows are very vague. You get a little hint of what the figure looks like when you see the shadow, but you can't really get into the specifics or the details. Just like that word implies, foreshadowing hints don't tell you the whole picture. And they can be wrong, right? You can start to suspect what's going to happen, but you don't really know 100% until you get to it. That's part of what can, for some stories or for some readers, make foreshadowing tricky, because you might think you know what's going to happen, but you could be led down a wrong track, and you might not pick up on it. Foreshadowing is definitely easier to figure out once you've finished reading the entire story, because at that point you know what's going to happen. So it's almost like once you see how the story turns out, there's a light bulb, an epiphany happens, right? A light bulb turns on in your head and you go, oh, wait a minute. Now that I think about it, in the beginning of the story, when the author wrote blah, 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 that was a little clue that this was going to happen in the end of the story. So there are two ways, knowing that that's true, there are two ways to approach foreshadowing. Foreshadowing, if you're a really keen reader, can be picked up on while you're actually reading before you get through the entire story, or it can be something that you look at back in hindsight. Now that you know how the story turns out, you can backtrack and figure out the clues that the author had planted along the way. Now, to take our foreshadowing analysis to the next step, what we're also going to do is look at the different ways that an author can include foreshadowing. We're going to start out with 5 basic types of foreshadowing. And the first one, it is what is known as the prescene. When an author uses prescene foreshadowing, what they're doing is they're putting a smaller version of a scene to come. So maybe at the end of the story, there's going to be this big murder, and the prescene might be earlier in the story where there is a smaller murder, or maybe even just an attempted murder. It doesn't even have to be successful. The prescene does not have to be the exact same event, but it has to be a smaller version, and that's where smaller could be less successful, version of what's going to happen later. Basically, prescene is letting us know that there's something bigger coming next. So, for example, if we are watching a movie where the action is taking place on a plane, we're in the cockpit with the pilot. The plane starts to hit turbulence, and the captain is struggling to regain control. Now, it doesn't last very long. The captain is able to be successful, gets through the turbulence, gets the plane flying smooth again. Everything seems like it's going to be fine. This would be a perfect prescene foreshadowing for maybe half an hour later, where they enter an even bigger field of turbulence. And now, this time, the captain is unable to get the plane under control. You could then look back and say, that was the first little hint that something worse was going to come. That little tease of the captain struggling with the turbulence foreshadowed this bigger example. All right, so our next type of foreshadowing is what's known as irrational concern. Irrational concern is when a character seems worried for no reason. This is super suspicious. This is usually something that seems unreasonable from our perspective or from another character's perspective, right? Like the character is getting all upset and is kind of warning, kind of like a Cassandra saying, "Don't go in there. That's so dangerous." And you're like, "What are you talking about? It's just a nursery school. Like nursery schools are safe and innocent. Why would you be so concerned about me going inside there?" It seems irrational. Or, for example, the teenage girls leaving their house, they're going to go out for the night with their friends, and the mother is going so overboard saying, "Promise me you'll be back before midnight." And they keep saying it. They keep harping on it. And you're like, all right, calm down. Like, the teenage girl's even like, "What are you talking about? I never break curfew. Of course I'm going to be home by midnight." The teenage girl might even say to the mother, "Mom, we live in the safest small town in America. Why are you so worried about me?" Even setting up that makes the foreshadowing extra strong because, again, our expectation is that nothing bad's going to happen. There's no reason why something bad would be happening. And the mother seems like she's getting all worked over nothing. But of course, because this is a story, something bad is definitely going to happen. And so this irrational concern the mother is happening is what's supposed to make us suspicious and what is foreshadowing later on when the teenage girl is going to have some kind of trouble. She's going to go out. She's probably not going to end up being home. She might end up being kidnapped. She might end up being killed. Something bad's going to happen to her. All right, so our next type of foreshadowing is what is known as the loaded gun. Although in literary circles, all snooty, this is most commonly known as Chekhov's gun, named after a Russian author who is one of the first to basically describe this technique. It's basically where a weapon of some kind, something that's going to cause damage, is shown to the reader super early in the story, usually out of context. Usually it's just seen somewhere, like it's seen in a drawer, it's seen on the table. In the scene that you see the weapon, it might not even be like a major part of that scene. So for example, it could just be like the example on the screen, the old man who's our main character is sitting at the desk. He's doing something really innocuous, looking at his stamp collection. And he opens up a drawer, not to pull out a weapon, but he needs his magnifying glass. And as he reaches for it, he brushes against a gun, a revolver. He takes the magnifying glass out, he closes the drawer. So as the audience member, you ask yourself, why did I need to have the character have a gun? First of all, why is there a gun in his drawer? And why did I have to have the camera pay attention and call my attention to the fact that his fingers brushed up against the gun? That's weird. That's suspicious, because that's foreshadowing. That gun is going to be used later in the story. And, you know, you could say, no, not necessarily. Well, yeah, that's true, not necessarily. But then why did the author mention it? And so that brings us back to something that is really important to know and understand about literature. If an author puts something into a story, it is there for a reason. It's not like real life. In real life, random things happen that are unconnected to other things all the time. Not in a story. If you're a good author, you are going to put things into a story, or in other words, everything you put into a story is going to be there for a reason. It's going to be there because it's helping you develop the plot, it's helping you develop the characters, it's helping you develop the theme, right? What I like to call the big three. So if a weapon is being shown, then it would make sense that it's used later on. And the only time a good author is going to do something like this and not have any kind of payoff is when they're trying to trick you, when they're planting what's known as red herring clues, right? Red herring clues are false clues that are meant to throw the reader or the audience off the scent. That way the ending ends up being a surprise, a twist that you didn't see coming. Okay, our next type of irony is a character's opinion. So this is usually way more overt, way more out in the open and obvious. The character is going to state their opinion about something, and their opinion is almost telling you what they think is going to happen. So a good example of this would be in detective stories, when the detective flat out says something like, "I told myself there would be no more bodies, but I didn't believe a word of it." This is basically foreshadowing the fact that there are going to be other bodies, there are going to be more murders that this detective is going to have to figure out. And then our final type of irony that we're going to talk about today is naming the event. This can be a way harder type of irony to pick up. It's almost always going to happen closer to the actual event itself. So you're not usually going to have this type of irony in the beginning of the story and then wait until the ending to see it come true. Although, I mean, you can. But naming the event is when an author lets you know exactly what's going to happen next in order to stress its importance. So you could almost argue that this is not even, I mean, some people might argue that this is not even necessarily foreshadowing, because if you're telling me what's going to happen, then you're not really hinting at it, right? You're being very explicit. In a way, this kind of goes against the whole point of foreshadowing, where it's supposed to be vague. But many people do consider this a type of foreshadowing, and there are subtler versions of it. There are versions where an author tells you what's going to happen without getting very specific. Like, I think a good example of that would be when a bully, you're watching like a movie set in a high school, and the bully of the school tells the nerdy kid, 3 o'clock, be there, be square, I'm going to kick your butt. I mean, he's telling you what's going to happen, and yet, if this is done well, in order for this to be foreshadowing, there would be a lot of suspense being built up where you're not 100% sure if it's actually going to happen. Like, just because the bully said it's going to happen doesn't mean it is. You're going to then be wondering, okay, is the nerdy kid actually going to show up? Is somebody going to try to stop them? Maybe a teacher is going to find out what's happening, and they're going to get involved, and then the event doesn't actually take place. The bully is naming the event, and yet, because there is still uncertainty, because there is a time lapse between the name and what happens, there can still be some foreshadowing and some suspenseful elements related to it. All right, so those are our different types of foreshadowing. There are others, but these are the 5 that we're going to start with as we look back at some of our short stories from this unit.